The New Orleans Saints have their fair share of different needs at different positions, but for my money, the place where they need to make the biggest impact this offseason is along the defensive line. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be helped out by our friends over at Locked On NFL Scouting, Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino, as they give us their first round selection for the New Orleans Saints. We're also going to be taking a look at some of the underrated needs for New Orleans, including, of course, linebacker, which may be a bigger need than we're all letting on. But first, we're going to be taking a look at the top needs for the New Orleans Saints, headlined, for my money, by the defensive line. We got all that coming up for you today. We appreciate you very much for being an everydayer and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day as a part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. It's even easier now to make every moment more because new customers are going to get $150 back in bonus bets by winning any $5 bet. Just head over to FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So for me, the defensive line is the place where the New Orleans Saints need to make the biggest impact this offseason, whether it's through the NFL draft or, of course, through free agency, which opens in exactly 1 week, which is why I wanted to kind of go over the Saints' top needs today, because it gives us that sort of week in advance. Of course, legal tampering begins on Monday. That's the period where players can begin to, kind of iron out some contracts, or their agents can start to iron out some contracts and come to agreements with teams that they'll eventually sign with. But ink doesn't go to paper until next Wednesday, when free agency officially opens at 4 p.m. Eastern time on the 13th. So let's take a look at what I believe are the Saints' top needs this offseason going into free agency. Please let me know what you think that the top needs are as well. Now, I'm going to be honest, I can kind of go in any order here. I think any of these top 3 needs can be argued as, this should be number 1 or this should be third or whatever. But I'm going to put them in the order that I feel most strongly about, but I'm not completely married to it either. It could change in about a week, in that time. So I'm going to start off with what I mentioned before, the defensive line. Particularly for me, it's edge rusher, defensive end. I think the New Orleans Saints have a couple of things that they would like to achieve there. You want to get younger, of course. You want to add more speed, more athleticism there. This was the Saints defense that did not reach 40 sacks in 2023. It's first time since before the 2017 season where that has happened. So this is something that you want to see the New Orleans Saints get right. And I think that independent from the next 2 positions that I'll go over, this is the one that's actually kind of most impacted by the talent that's on the team, or that's specifically at the position, as opposed to the ability to be aided in other ways, i.e. the system on the offensive side could help where a couple of needs are, maybe make things a little bit less drastic. For the New Orleans Saints on the defensive side, you want to get your run defense better, you want to get your pass rush better, and the secondary is not always going to be able to bail you out when you can't. So for me, that's why the defensive line is the biggest need, in my opinion. So here are a couple of players that the Saints could go ahead and target. Of course, we know that the best edge rusher on the market, hands down, in my opinion at least, is Carolina Panthers defensive end Brian Burns. That is going to be way over anything that the Saints would be able to do trade-wise, even if he were to, whatever. Like, no matter what happens, I think the Saints are out on that conversation for sure. A top edge that fits would be Danielle Hunter, coming out of Minnesota, but the Vikings are really intent on getting that contract done as well. In fact, there's been some news about some momentum towards all of that too. So maybe that doesn't actually happen. So the realistic options for me in free agency are Josh Uche, coming out of New England, and then Leonard Floyd, coming most recently out of Buffalo, but also having spent time with the Rams. I like both of these guys as potential situational pass rushers for the New Orleans Saints. You're not looking for a 4 or a 3 down, 4 down, however it is that you want to look at it. You're not looking for an every down guy. You're looking for somebody to come out there and help you supplement the pass rush. I think both those guys would be able to do that. In the NFL draft, of course, they have options as well. Alabama's Dallas Turner probably leads the list for a lot of folks, and understandably so. UCLA's Laiatu Latu is the best and most polished edge rusher in this class, but best overall defensive end would probably, in terms of incorporating the run game, things like that, which the New Orleans Saints will consider, would be Florida State defensive end Jared Verse, who can also, of course, rush the passer for you, has length, all of those other things. So three very, very different types of edge rushers that should be available when the Saints are on the board at 14. One of them should be available when the Saints are on the board at 14. So lots of opportunity to be able to address what I believe is their biggest need over on the defensive line. And that's just looking on the edges. They could stand to bulk up the defensive interior as well, but might get a little bit of help there by re-signing Malcolm Roach. Number 2 for me is big-bodied wide receiver. Michael Thomas, 90%, right, is not going to be back in 2024. So the Saints are going to be looking for the guy that can help them move the chains, that can, that can make those tough catches, that can be the sure-handed guy. Best wide receiver on the market, in my opinion, is Calvin Ridley coming out of Jacksonville. There's probably a good chance that he ends up staying in Jacksonville, but there's going to be a lot of competition for him. Over 1,000 yards last year, 8 receiving touchdowns last year as well, led the team in both of those metrics. He should get a pretty nice payday out on the open market. So that might be a little bit outside of the realm of what the New Orleans Saints would be able to afford. But if you're looking for a big-bodied guy that's realistic, Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver Tyler Boyd, not T. Higgins, but Tyler Boyd is a guy that might be able to come in and help you out there. Is he as exciting as a T. Higgins? Is he as exciting as a Michael Pittman Jr. out of Indianapolis? Is he as exciting as a Calvin Ridley out of Jacksonville? No, but is he somebody that is a big body dude, that is a pretty good hands guy that can go out there and get some catches for you? Absolutely. And don't worry, if you don't like any of the options that are there in free agency, wait to see if Hunter Renfrow ends up hitting the market. Feels like a shoe-in decision right there. And then, of course, there's the draft options. Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU if you want a first-rounder. Malachi Corley out of Western Kentucky if you want a second-rounder. Rosemy Jacksaint if you want out of Georgia, if you want to wait a little bit later and then go for somebody that is in the day 3, late day 2 kind of range. Xavier Leggett, of course, out of University of South Carolina. Before I forget about him, he's probably a day 2 guy as well. Could maybe, if the right team likes him, could be a first round guy for all we know. So we'll see which way that goes. But again, lots of options for the Saints to be able to address all of those needs. And then finally for me, I'm going to say offensive line, particularly depth. I'm feeling a lot better about where the Saints are tackle-wise. I think you still want to bring in some competition for Trevor Penning over on the left side. Competition rather, breeds excellence. So get some of that competition in there. Best guy on the market is Tyron Smith coming out of Dallas. I think that would be, well out of the Saints price range there. But a guy like Jermaine Illuminor coming out of the Las Vegas Raiders, that's somebody that's in a similar familiar system to what the New Orleans Saints are used to doing. There's some interior offensive linemen that are not used to doing, but that are going to be doing going into 2024. There's some interior offensive linemen that check those boxes as well. Isaiah Wynn and Kendall Lamb coming out of Miami on the interior, guys that are accustomed to that wide zone offense approach. And then, of course, fantastic draft options. First round guy like an Olu Fashanu out of Penn State. Second round guy like a Patrick Paul out of Houston. A trade up option like a guy like Kingsley Suamataia out of BYU. And then if you want to wait until a little bit later in the draft, a Javon Foster out of Missouri, I think all of those guys are winners. So again, Saints, edge rusher / defensive end, possession wide receiver, offensive line, inside and out. There's even some interior offensive line options in the draft, like Javion Cohen coming out of Miami. Saints have a lot of options and a lot of ways to address their biggest needs. But to me, those are the big 3 in some order. Let me know what you think the order that they come in is, or if you think there's a bigger need. But I'm going to get to some of the more underrated needs for the Saints coming up next, leading off with linebacker, which might be a bigger need than I think we're giving it credit. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. And right now you can shoot your shot with America's #1 sportsbook. And it's a great time if you're a new user because you can get $150 in bonus bets by winning any $5 bet. You can go and pick a heavy favorite right now. The New Orleans Pelicans coming off of a 41-point victory over the Toronto Raptors. Right now, 3 games ahead of the Dallas Mavericks in the Southwestern Division in the NBA. And look, I know the NBA itself doesn't really care about divisions, but the sports book does. And it's a great way to go ahead and win that early $5 bet. So you can win this $150 in bonus bets. The Pelicans right now, -350 heavy favorites in the Southwest Division. Win that $5 bet, and then you've got $150 coming your way. Then you can bet on all of your favorite NBA players and teams in a bunch of different ways, including quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and much more. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. That's FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. The New Orleans Saints might have a bigger need on the defensive side that we're not giving enough attention to at linebacker. Appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. Every day, don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 national sports stream, the first of its kind over on YouTube. Catch up with all the great coverage that we had from across the combine, across our 14 or 15 different shows that were in Indianapolis, getting everything going. You can find a whole bunch of takeaways from the NFL Combine today with the Locked On Sports Today YouTube stream, that national sports YouTube stream, first of its kind. So go check it out today. All right, so I think the Saints might have a bigger need at linebacker than maybe we're giving credit, but I think that there are three kind of underrated needs for the New Orleans Saints. We hit the kind of top needs, but now I think that there's a couple of other positions where you can kind of funnel in some more talent, try to find ways to replace talent that you're losing, things like that. So some of this is based on talent that's being lost. Some of it is based on looking ahead to talent that will eventually be lost. And then in another case, it's just what you don't have and need to add to. So let's start with the place where I think talent will eventually be lost that you need to make sure you're ready for. And for me, that's linebacker. Demario Davis is going to have another great 2024, just like he had another great 2023, just like he had a great 2022. The guy just, the amount of work that he puts in to maintain his body and do all of these other things, it's absolutely incredible. And so I think that what you're looking for is who's after him, who's beside him. Pete Werner has had some moments where he's missed the field because of injuries, things like that. Who steps in place of him? If ever you do need to, have somebody come in for Demario Davis, even if it's not necessarily to start for him for an entire game, but there was a game last season to where he was given he told us a 0% chance to play. I believe he even said less than 0% chance to play, and then ended up being able to get out there on the field anyway. I believe, if I recall correctly, there was a lot of, those other linebackers that got mixed in, Nephi Sewell, Zach Bond, all that, just to kind of keep the workload manageable in that game for him. So if you want to have that kind of reserve, you got to add talent there. And right now the Saints don't necessarily have a lot of those players on the roster. And so I think you have to add there. So, you can look to free agency. Like, one of the guys that I actually really like, and this is one of the rare circumstances in which a player gets moved on from by a team, and you start getting those tweets and those mentions and those texts and those questions from your insider group and stuff like that, asking like, hey, would this player be a good fit for the Saints? Where I actually said yes. It's Jerome Baker, the linebacker out of Miami, that they're going to be moving on from because the Miami Dolphins are actually in a cap crisis. They have just been shedding players here recently. And Jerome Baker is kind of the latest on the list, and he's got a lot of overlap with a lot of players on this New Orleans Saints roster, past and present, right? Because he was a former Ohio State linebacker, so he's got a lot of those connections with players over on the defensive side there. So I think that he's a good player. Is he a little bit undersized for what the Saints usually go for? Yeah, 6'2", 225 or so. But look, that's just linebacker in the NFL these days. They're just smaller. You're not going to find a bunch of the 6'3", 250-pound, 240-pound linebackers these days. It's just not going to happen. There are some of those that will be available, and you can go and grab them. But I do think that a guy like Jerome Baker, who can play, could move around on the line a little bit, play your weak side guy, do whatever it is that you need, could be good depth, and could be a guy that you end up kind of maybe assigning some other opportunities to maybe get after the passer, things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity for a guy like Jerome Baker. So that could be a way that the Saints go. Saints could look to the draft as well. I mean, Peyton Wilson, to me, is linebacker 1 in this class coming out of NC State. But outside of him, there's other guys that I really like. Cedric Gray, who I put in the mock draft this past week. There's some good special teamers that can develop into core players or core depth. Let me call it that instead. Dallas Gant out of Toledo, for instance, who also himself is a former Ohio State Buckeye. So you keep the pipeline alive and all that. So I think this is another situation where the Saints would have the options out there without having to take some type of a big swing. Again, I don't think that this team takes a big swing. I don't think Danielle Hunter's in the stars for the New Orleans Saints. I don't think that I don't know, another big name player like a Josh Allen, or Josh Allen, the pass rusher out of Jacksonville, or a Michael Pittman out of Indianapolis if he actually hits the market. Like, we'll see what happens there. It might be a tag and trade type of a situation, but I don't think you're going to get involved in any of that if you're the New Orleans Saints, and that includes those tag and trade opportunities. Somebody asked me a very interesting question earlier about would the Saints be able to trade Marshawn Lattimore for L'Jarius Sneed? It's very rare that you see the player for player trades, but also you have to give L'Jarius Sneed a new contract, and the Saints aren't in a hurry to trade Marshawn Lattimore the way that Kansas City would be looking to offload L'Jarius Sneed probably before the draft to recoup some of the draft capital. The Saints, instead, they're probably not doing anything until after post June 1 and then before training camp, if they are going to do anything with Marshawn Lattimore, which, again, you kind of hope that they don't. Speaking of, if the Saints were to trade away Marshawn Lattimore, obviously cornerback hits this list, but my next position on the sort of sneaky needs list is safety. And maybe it's a little bit less sneaky than it was before, right? Because now you know that they're going to be moving on from Marcus Maye, so you know that they're going to be looking for somebody, but there's still a chance that they fill that with players that are in-house, right? Outgoing free agents like Jonathan Abram, Lonnie Johnson Jr., who the Saints like a lot. Ugo Amadi is another guy that could potentially be back. You move around, you've got Jordan Howden, you've got your ability to be able to kind of see where he fits in. You can change and tweak the role of Tyrann Mathieu, let him play in the box more, and then have Jordan Howden be your deep safety. Like, there's a lot of different configurations and ways that you can kind of shake up the safety position to make sure that you can make up for the fact that you're moving on from Marcus Maye. But you've also had to kind of live life without Marcus Maye. You've actually had to live life without Marcus Maye exactly as much as you've lived life with Marcus Maye on the field if you're the New Orleans Saints, 17 games over the course of the past 2 seasons. So there's some ways to go there. The Seahawks moving on from both safeties, Kajay Diggs as well as Jamal Adams. I would stay as far away from Jamal Adams as possible, but Diggs, really interesting prospect there, really interesting opportunity there. And then, we've gone over several safety prospects that could potentially fit for New Orleans, namely Trey Taylor out of Air Force, Mark Perry out of TCU, and others. There's a lot of different ways that the Saints can go there, but I think that safety is obviously one of those spots you're absolutely going to add talent to, but might be a little bit more of a need in terms of keeping the strength of the secondary as strong as possible, especially if the defensive line needs some time to kind of figure out who they are early on in the season. And then finally, so linebacker was, getting ready for talent that you may lose soon or at some point. Safety was all about refilling a role or talent that you're set to lose. This one for me is just adding to a room that you don't really have a lot of options in so far, and that's tight end. And you can do that through free agency. You can find some free agent guys that you want to try to bring in, things like that. But the names aren't super exciting when it comes to free agency. I think this tight end group is really good, but it's really good late too. It's not like the tight end group last year to where you kind of had to get in there in the first 3 rounds. This one, you can find guys like Jaheim Bell, like Tip Ryman, like McLaughlin out of Arizona, if I recall correctly. There's these, there are these later round tight ends that you could bring in that could still have, a good impact for you. And then, of course, the mid-round guys that we've talked about a bunch, Ben Sinnott, and then, of course, Theo Johnson out of Penn State. So lots of opportunities. Jatavion Sanders out of Texas as well. Good opportunities to add there, but I think you absolutely have to add there. So I think linebacker, safety, and then tight end, sneaky-ish needs to keep an eye out on over the course of the offseason. Coming up next, we get some help from our friends, Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino over at Locked On NFL Scouting, who draft a big-time offensive tackle to the New Orleans Saints at 14. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience, all the things that will help you bring home a championship trophy are all the same qualities that will also help you keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has something for you to help you maintain your vehicle, level it up to peak performance, whether it's from superchargers to roof racks, LED headlights, whatever it is that you're looking for, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll be able to find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit the first time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So you find all the parts that you need at the prices that you want to easily help turn your car into an MVP and start stacking those wins. Keep your ride or die alive today at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guaranteed fit available only to U.S. customers. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. A couple of our NFL draft insiders here on the network pick a big-time offensive tackle to lead things off for the New Orleans Saints in the recent first-round mock draft. I think that they made the right decision, but I'm interested in what other possibilities could have been. So we're going to break all that down here as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you for being here. Don't forget, we are your team every day. So we'll be back here with another fresh episode tomorrow afternoon, making sure you got everything that you need, or not tomorrow afternoon. I don't know why I said tomorrow afternoon, but tomorrow. To make sure that you got everything that you need continuing on here throughout a very, very busy week ahead of NFL free agency. So our friends Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino over at the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, which you should absolutely be checking out along with Locked On NFL Draft, to just kind of keep up to date with everything going on around the offseason, the NFL draft, free agency, all of that good stuff. Did their post-combine first round mock draft. And for the New Orleans Saints at pick 14, they made their selection that I want to kind of go over here a little bit and then kind of like loop it, tie it all together in terms of needs and everything. And there's something really interesting that Kyle thought about during this process that I thought made a lot of sense. So let's take a look at what the pick was first, and then we'll come back and we'll break it down. Here's Kyle and Joe from Locked On NFL Scouting.
Was mentally prepared to draft one offensive lineman for the New Orleans Saints at 14. And then you didn't go offensive line, so now I have to pick a different one, which I'm kind of bummed out about because I wanted to pick the other guy. But if Olu Fashanu's here at 14, the Saints are going to make this pick, right? As a team that premium position, Ryan Ramczak's getting up there a little bit. Trevor Penning has not materialized the way that they hoped that he would. Andrew Speed is a contract that has come off the books for them. This is just intersection of positional need or positional value with potential need on the line with best player available, all intersecting in one spot for the Saints. It's too good to pass up. So I'll draft Olu Fashanu for the Saints.
So Olu Fashanu, the Penn State offensive tackle, this is a guy that we've talked about a bunch here on the show with the Everydayers. A big thing about this offensive tackle is that he's a starter in the league. He's a guy that people are like consensus convinced is going to be an all-pro at the next level. He did not allow a sack in his entire career over at Penn State. Not the most pass-heavy offense, to be fair, but still just a wrecking ball of a dude, and one that I think is probably, sans Joe Alt. Of course, he's the top tackle in the league, and then just kind of depends upon what you're looking for. You want somebody that's a little bit more athletic, all those other things. Then you can make your argument between each one. Sure, Joe Alt is faster, but moving laterally, being able to climb up, being able to get to the second level, third level, all those other things, and then just being an absolute mauler all the way. Olu Fashanu checks all those boxes, and he's a polished guy. Even though he's a guy that, is relatively new to football and everything, he has just been absolutely outstanding. So I love this pick for New Orleans, even though it counteracts or counters what we were discussing earlier as offensive tackle for me, maybe falling down the board of things that are most, necessary for the New Orleans Saints to address. It's still a way to go. I think that what this requires is a couple of different things. The first of which is that you have to have really address your defensive line and your pass catcher problem, or not pass catcher problem, but like your pass catcher numbers problem. Like the Saints only have 3 wide receivers on their roster right now. And so you have to address both of those things in free agency before the NFL draft rolls around. Now, if you're the New Orleans Saints, that's what you want to do anyway. That way you can go best player available at 14. In this mock draft, and the way that the board shook out, which was perfect for New Orleans, by the way, you had several quarterbacks go early. You had all 3 of the top 3 wide receivers go first. So when you have all of those selections coming off the board pretty quick, it helps you out a ton. And you saw Amarius Mims, the recent sort of influx or the recent sort of boosted offensive tackle right now. He went off the board in the top 10. It just drops extremely talented players like this all the way down for you. at 14. So if you can address all those things and go best player available, there's a good chance that if Olu Fashanu is on the board at 14, he's probably the best player available. Now, some might disagree because Brock Bowers, the tight end out of Georgia, was still on the board. He went one pick later to the Indianapolis Colts. But there was one thing that I thought was very interesting that Kyle brought up, and it was the intersectionality of position value, best player available, and team need. And I think that that's something that's really, really important to highlight, is that a lot of times we talk about, well, what are the team needs? What are the things that the team is needing and stuff like that? But also people will make the argument to go best player available, which is always like a really good way to go in the draft. If you can get the best player that's available to you at your draft pick, odds are that player is more likely to pan out than if you go for the fifth best player that's on the board because they intersect with your need. But let's not pretend that best player available isn't impacted by your team needs. That's why free agency coming before the draft is so important, because it allows you to be able to kind of fill all of those team needs to a place where you're at least comfortable fielding a team in 2024. And then you walk into the NFL draft and you're maybe a little bit less clouded by your team needs because, oh yeah, there's still some questions about how patient the team wants to be about Trevor Penning. There's still some questions about what the overall health long-term is going to be for Ryan Ramczyk. Both of those things are true. However, if you're the New Orleans Saints, you also have the ability to say, okay, well, brought in this guy, added this player, feel really good about depth. This player is going to compete with Trevor a little bit. You got a backup. They really like Landon Young behind Ryan Ramczyk. Nick Saldiveri's floating around in there. Can they get Max Garcia back? We'll see what happens with Andrus Peat, all of that. If they address enough of that with in-house and outside free agents, then all of a sudden team need doesn't really impact best player available. And you can just make the clear decision, the clear-eyed decision of selecting the best player available. And in this case, I mean, just looking at the players that went after Brock Bowers out, the tight end out of Georgia, the interior offensive lineman, but also versatile Oregon offensive lineman, Jackson Powers Johnson was right after that. Johnny Newton out of Illinois, the defensive tackle. After that, you could have gone with him for New Orleans too. That could have been a lot of fun. Tlisa Fuaga out of Oregon State went right after that to the Cincinnati Bengals. Great pick, great team match there as well. Maybe that's the other tackle that Kyle was talking about that he really wanted to mock to New Orleans, but because the previous pick passed on Olu Fashanu and went for Byron Murphy Jr., the defensive tackle out of Texas, it gave him the opportunity to go with Fashanu. It's a good representation of how things work in the NFL draft. Sometimes you just have to be ready for a guy that you didn't expect to be on the board to be on the board. And if there's a guy that you didn't expect to be on the board to be on the board, either there's a reason why and you already know it, medicals, checks wise, whatever it might be, or that's the guy that you should be picking. Like if you look up at your board and you go, why is he still there? Go get that player. And for me, Olu Fashanu out of Pitt State can very well be that player. For folks who are curious, Dallas Turner was the only defensive tackle to have gone off the board by this time. He went number 12 to the Denver Broncos. Pretty funny to think that, that would be a fit for Sean Payton, right? Considering how much they wanted those big guys here in New Orleans for so long, which is probably a little bit more of a Dennis Allen thing than a Sean Payton thing, but still interesting. Amarius Mims, J.C. Latham both went early as well. So you did see a couple of tackles go off the board. But outside of that, it was quarterbacks, Joe Alt, who you already know is going to be top 5, bunch of wide receivers, and a corner. And that's big for the New Orleans Saints. When you've got 4 quarterbacks, 3 wide receivers, we try to do my math here, 4 quarterbacks, 3 wide receivers, a top corner in Quinyon Mitchell, and who would be somebody else that would make sense going up here? Let's say one edge rusher or something like that. That's 9 players off the board already. You've got a really good shot to get somebody of high value for you at 14. And I think that will happen for the New Orleans Saints if they stick and pick at 14. So Olu Fashanu at 14 was the selection there. Tomorrow we'll be taking a look at Locked On NFL Draft, who went to the other side of the football for New Orleans. We got that coming up for you tomorrow, along with keep you up to date with everything going on with your New Orleans Saints. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. Every day, like I mentioned, 41-point victory and a huge game from Trey Murphy and the New Orleans Pelicans. Locked On Pelicans, Jake Madison. Very fun episode. Go and check that out next. We appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. And of course, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation, I'll holla at you.